But let me give you my background, because that explains, I think, some of what I'm going to say. My intention was to become a historian. My first book, when I had learned to read and write, was a book on history. When I was 9, I had decided that I would become a historian when I came of age. The problem, though, was that we had a baby boom after the Second World War. So when I arrived at the university, they told me that all the baby boomers had already been there, and they had taken all the places that were available for teachers in history. So I had to find something else to do. I had been involved in student politics, and there was one other who came and boasted that he had been accepted for a post in the diplomatic service. So I decided if that stupid one could make it to diplomacy, so could I. So I became a diplomat instead. I was posted to Hanoi immediately after the war, and then I was in Geneva as a trade negotiator. But I married, and we were about to have children. And we had introduced in Sweden the idea of paternity leave. And at the end of the 70s, the leadership in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs wasn't very fond of diplomats at paternity leave. So I had to find something else to do, and I joined the Ministry of Finance, a think tank, because when you are in a think tank, you could produce a draft of your ideas, you can send it out for review, and then you could disappear for a couple of months and be with your children. So Ministry of Finance at the time was an excellent place for paternity leavers. I went on, we made studies of several of the areas where the Swedish politics had a problem. We designed a new agricultural policy, we designed a new tax system, and we also undertook pension reform, which is one of the trickiest things you can do in Western Europe. But the ultimate problem was agricultural reform, because the farmers got so upset that their organizations planted 6 rows of spruce outside our dacha as a revenge for the proposal that I had put forward. So the authorities decided that I should do something less controversial, and they made me the head of the long-term survey of the Swedish economy, because that was the real backwater at the time. But they had miscalculated, because this was the early 1990s, and only a couple of weeks after I had took up that post, the financial crisis of the early 90s broke out, and it was worse in Sweden and Finland than in any other Western European country. So I was put in charge of putting together crisis packages to solve the crisis. And in the meantime, we developed also this idea of pension reform. And I got to know that almost as angry as farmers, pensioners could be. So it was time to switch jobs again, and I joined the Swedish Association of Local Authorities, which is all county councils and municipalities form their organization to have a dialogue with the government about what can local self-rule, local self-management provide in the forming of a society. I went on to join the association of the Confederation of Professional Associations, which organizes doctors, lawyers, teachers, and whatnot, and is one of the big trade union centrals. But then I thought, now I've spent 30 years as a manager in government ministries, in various departments. Now I want to do something fun. So I returned to history. I had written some biographies of Axel Oxenstierna, who's the major Swedish statesman all through the ages, on the Wallenbergs, who is the most important financial dynasty in Sweden. But I returned to my roots and wrote 3 volumes and 2,000 pages about Skåne, which is the southernmost province in Sweden, but it has belonged both to Sweden and to Denmark. It's the see of the archbishop who all through the Middle Ages dominated the church in Sweden, but it was also the arena for the most dramatic Reformation when we went through from the Catholic to the Protestant church. So in a microcosm of a small province with only slightly more than 1 million inhabitants, I could enshrine the entire Nordic history and what it has all been about. I think the beauty of the school is that it has exactly the 2 ingredients that I've tried to combine through my working life, and that is the dialogue between academia and practical life. Some of you are researchers, some of you are involved in media, in government, in various organizations, but it's really when you have the contact between the 2 that you can develop new ideas. And for my personal experience, I would say I was trained as a historian. I've been working as an economist, and the link between the 2 is really that if you go back and try to put the question, how did it all begin? That is perhaps the most productive question you can ask when you're involved in some kind of responsibility. Because if you go back and look at the crossroads when the important decisions have been taken, be it 1992, 1958, 1917, or sometime in the 19th century, when you analyzed the alternatives that were before decision makers, try to understand how they reason, try to look at what did they overlook, what should they have thought of. You create a distance to the situations that we have today, and you could see that it would be possible to do things in different ways. And that distance, I think, is one of the most important prerequisites for looking ahead and trying to envision what alternatives do we have in the future, what can we do to move on. I was very much encouraged when I saw the title of this seminar in Stockholm, because freedom and responsibility is very much what our history has been about for the last, say, 300 or 400 years, and gives you a clue to where we are today. When I came to Jena the first time in '96, this was the second round of Yeltsin's presidential election, and we were in Altai, and it was very much up in the air what would happen with that election and after that election. But when we had a seminar like this, your colleagues at the time put questions about Swedish socialism, and those questions persisted for several years and several seminars to come, and I was forced to think about what is really Swedish society about. And I tried to put it in a nutshell and say that the Swedish society is the idea of a fairly generous welfare state that is paid for by the most competitive capitalism in the world. So it's a mixture of competitive capitalism and welfare state. And how did this develop? One of my professors, she puts it like this: if you try to go beneath the surface of the Nordic societies, you will always find the independent peasant society. The independent and egalitarian peasant society is at the root of those societies that have emerged in the Nordic countries. And this is because when you had feudalism all over Europe, you had an exception to that in the Nordic countries, in that we had nobility, we had monarchy, but they never managed to make the peasants subordinated to the nobility in the way that it was in most other European countries. The peasants, some of the peasants were working on the estates of the nobility, but the majority of them owned their own farms. They had their own meetings in the parishes. They met and they decided how to conduct the affairs of that parish. They paid their taxes to the crown, and sometimes they also paid for the land to the nobility. But the fundamental thing was they managed to keep their individual liberty, and they managed to manage their own affairs. Sometimes history takes shape because of accidents. We had a very complicated situation in the 15th century when the leading noble circles in Denmark and in Sweden vied for hegemony in the Nordic countries. We had a union of all the Nordic countries. It was dominated by the Danish nobility, but we had mineral resources in Sweden that were exploited with the help of the German Hansa. And the German Hansa encouraged the Swedish nobility to oppose the Danes because they hoped that that would give them a better deal when it came to buying Swedish iron and Swedish copper. And in that strife between the Swedish and Danish nobility, the Swedish nobility managed to make Sweden an independent country. But on top of that, we also had the emergence of a modern monarchy. We had a young king that came to the throne in the early 16th century, and you had the same pattern all over Western Europe. Young kings emerge. They discovered that the nobility dominated their societies. They wanted to have power. And if you look at England or France or Spain, the young monarchs managed to take that power by chopping the heads off the nobility in case they didn't hang them. And when all in the high nobility were gone, they put their own men in instead. And so they managed to create the absolute monarchy that was the dominant form of government in Europe for several centuries. But in Sweden, we did it in another way. The man who founded the state was a king called Gustavus Vasa. And he went about it in a more political way than it was done in the other European countries. We had some prototype of a parliament already when he became king, but he was the one who made parliament the most important political arena in the country. We had 4 estates in parliament. We had the nobility, we had the clergy, we had the burghers of the cities, but we also had the independent peasants. If you look at European political history, you will find only 2 countries where peasants have had a role in politics all through the centuries, and that is Sweden and Switzerland. The estates in Sweden were the ones who took all decisions on taxes, and they also decided whether it was allowed for the king to conscript for armies. The king went to parliament and said, I want this kind of power, that kind of power, I want to curtail the nobility in this respect or that. And he went to the nobility first, because the nobility was the most respected estate. And when he had put his proposals to them, they said, that was the most stupid thing we ever heard. We've never done it like that before. We reject the proposal. But the king went on to the non-noble estates. And the non-noble estates said, that wasn't a bad idea, but if you want to see it happen, you should put it through more forcefully. And the king went back to the noble estate and said, you heard all the cries and jeers from the other estates. You have to accommodate my proposal if you are to come back from this parliament with your life in keep. And that was not only a vain threat, because we had a couple of small bloodbaths in the political history of the 16th century in Sweden. We took a couple of people in the opposition, we led them out to the marketplace, and we chopped their heads off. And that has a somewhat important effect on the debate climate at the parliament. So the nobility said, okay, you can have half of what you ask for, or a third of it. And this triggered a series of events which meant that through the 16th and 17th century, the king managed to transform power from the nobility to the monarchy, which meant that at the beginning of the 17th century, we could develop the most modern central state in all Europe, which served as a model for Prussia, for Denmark, and ultimately also for Peter the Great. Because when Peter the Great designed his apparatus of the state, he used the Swedish model, and some of the first authorities that Peter instituted even took their names from their Swedish counterparts. Now, the beauty of this was that Oxenstierna, who was the architect of this state, he developed it in a way that was different from Peter the Great in one very important respect. It was a centralized state, but the centralized state managed to coexist with local self-government. Because when the king had moved power from the nobility to the monarchy, he had done so by the concurrence of the non-noble estates in Parliament. And in exchange for their support, when he took over power, he gave them authority over important local decisions. The local municipalities was to decide on schools, on poor relief, on the upkeep of the church, on the maintenance of the priest, many such decisions, and ultimately about schools and what came thereafter. And this made the Swedish state a sort of dual state. When you had a strong central state that developed a fairly honest civil servant society, but you also had strong local government. And the beauty of strong local government was that my ancestors had to sit down on local council meetings. They had to raise themselves above their own family and their own farm and take decisions for the whole community and for the area that was under this local council. So they developed a sort of self-government which involved the responsibility that the title of this seminar is talking about. But this authority in local affairs was something that they also used when they came to Parliament and were to speak on the nation's affairs. So when the Swedish society was modernized in the 19th century, and we went from a parliament of 4 estates to a modern bicameral parliament, nearly all the people who were elected to the new parliament, they had had their political training at the local level. So they continued the tradition that in important affairs, the Parliament said, this is not something that we should manage. It should be the responsibility of the local authorities. Now, this is also why we managed during the 19th century to develop what is called in Sweden the popular movements. It set out with those who were opposed to various strands in the dominant Protestant religion it continued with the temperance movement, because we, like all northern countries, and Russia, I think, is not an exception, had a huge problem with people drinking too much. I mean, drink in the 19th century was one of the most important obstacles to productivity development in the Swedish economy, and people realized that if you should develop the country, you had to do something about drink, but it was not imposed from above, but it was something that went through a huge temperance movement where neighbors tried to persuade other neighbors to drink a little less or not to drink altogether. And the experience from those religious movements and from the temperance movements, they laid the foundation for the working class movement that developed in the late 19th century. The working class movement was to some extent influenced by the same revolutionary attitudes that you had in Russia. But in Sweden, the revolutionary sentiment never gained the upper hand, because those who were in the working class movement had also the experience of local self-government, and the Swedish working class movement very soon turned into a reformist movement that tried to achieve a new society piece by piece. The Social Democrats in Sweden joined the government more definitely in the 1930s. But already from the beginning of the 20th century, they managed to win majorities on local councils in the most important cities. So they used local self-government to put through reforms that was a sort of experiment that was then put on a national scale once they joined the national government. Lena pointed to the importance of the church in the development in Swedish society. And I should say that one of the most important ingredients in Protestantism is that the Protestant church wanted its members to understand the Bible on their own. So the church, one of the first things that were undertaken was that the Bible was translated from Latin into Swedish in the 16th century. And it was printed and distributed to all parishes. And their priests and their assistants were instructed to teach the children to understand what was in the Bible, and in the shorter form of the Bible that was called the Catechism, where Luther assembled the main strands of his ideology. Now, this encouraged a widespread literacy in the Swedish peasant class. So already in the 17th century, the Swedish peasants, they were poor, but many more of them could read and write than in most other countries in Europe. And this persisted into the 19th century. At the outset of the 19th century, Sweden was one of the poorest countries in Europe. Swedes emigrated to Petersburg because there they could expect a better life. My grandmother was baptized Olga because in the ambitious middle class in Sweden at the time, they hope that she might emigrate to Petersburg and marry some rich Russian. So she even learned Russian at school to have a better chance on the marriage market in St. Petersburg. And then came, unfortunately, the revolution, so she had to stay in Sweden. And I'm grateful to the revolution because of that, because otherwise I wouldn't have been me, or I would have been someone completely different. So I'm very happy that you managed to keep Olga in Sweden and didn't take her over. But what brought about the change was really the literacy. Because when Western Europe started to develop, when you had the Industrial Revolution, newspapers was one of the most important things in the new society. And peasants in Sweden, they read newspapers, they became aware of new opportunities, they started to export their oats to France and England. When you were involved in the Crimean War and oats exports from Russia were stopped, we climbed in and took the chance, and the oats exports from Sweden to France and Britain triggered off the economic development in Sweden. We built railways to transport oats from the inland to our ports. When we built the railways, we set about the mechanical engineering industry. The literate peasant stopped being peasants. They went to the cities. They took jobs in the emerging industry. Some of them became engineers and made some of the most important inventions. You can talk about Ericsson, you can talk about Alfa Laval, you can talk about ABB. Many of those Swedish multinationals were founded in the second half of the 19th century, and one of the most important explanations why they could develop was that they had a literate population that could very rapidly learn the complicated tasks in the emerging engineering industries. So we entered the 20th century with some of the industries that became keys in industrial development all over the Western world. And we were a free trade country since the 1860s. So the Swedish industries that developed, they went on export to other countries. Because just as Lena said, Sweden is a very small country. So our home market was not nearly enough for those emerging industries. Within 5 years of their emergence, many of them sold 80–90% of all their production on export. And the fact that they were exporters meant that they were exposed to competition from similar industries in other Western countries. So to manage that competition, they had to develop. And when you look at those industries in Sweden that are now 150 years old, they have went through some 4 or 5 technological transformations because they have been forced to reform to keep abreast. Now, those transformations have also affected people that work in them. And one of the beauties of the Swedish development is that we have had a comparatively peaceful journey. Of course, we have had strike movements, but compared to other countries, we have been less exposed to strikes and lockouts than most others. And the explanation is that the working class movement that developed managed to organize almost all the workers in the workplace. When you compare Swedish trade unions to trade unions in other countries in Europe, one important difference is that the Swedish working class, and not only the working class, but also civil servants like myself and people who work in private industry as white-collar workers, nearly all are unionized. We have a degree of trade union organization which runs to some 80% on average, and in many workplaces it's more than that. And the fact that Swedish unions organize almost all the workers in the workplace, and not only 5 or 10% of them, like in France or in Spain, means that the Swedish unions must take responsibility for all their workers, and not only the most activist few, but see to it that we organize a society that is conducive to them all. This the Swedish unions made through politics. We have a debate in Sweden. Is it a good thing that our most important trade union, the LO for the blue-collar workers, have very close ties to the Social Democratic Party, and it funds most of the election campaign of the Social Democratic Party? And it's debatable whether that's a good thing in a modern society. But if you look at 100 years back, the close ties between the trade union and the Social Democratic Party helped us bring about the welfare state. Because the unions realized that companies come and go. They have some decades of glory, then they lose in competition, they go bust. And if you build the social welfare on the individual company, the workers are very badly off when the company goes bust. So if you tie social welfare to the individual enterprise, you will have something that hampers development in your society, because if that enterprise threatens to close down or to sack, say, 50% of its workforce, you will have a strike where the workers fight for their lives, because if the enterprise is closed down, they will be without their social security. And this is exactly what happens in society where you have social welfare based on the enterprise. So already from the early 20th century, the Social Democrats tried to develop national schemes for social welfare. And the fact that you transfer responsibility for social welfare from the enterprises to the state means that you can have this rapid industrial development where enterprises come and go, because the workers know that if I am sacked because my company goes bust, I can rely on unemployment insurance. I will be trained for a new job through the labor market services, and I will find a new job in an expanding enterprise, so I don't have to be afraid of industrial development and industrial change, but I will go on. I mean, an excellent example of this is the debate about artificial intelligence and how artificial intelligence will affect our society. My wife is engaged in running a major project for the Wallenberg family on how the Wallenberg enterprises, which dominate Swedish economic life, how they can undertake the transformation to AI without putting their employees at risk. Similar projects are undertaken on the state side to see how can we develop labor market services to help people come over in the new artificial intelligence society. And I'm a member of the Academy of Sciences, and we and others, we fund research on artificial intelligence so the Swedish industry can be at the forefront when artificial intelligence takes over much of the economic life in society. So what you look at in Sweden is an intricate interplay between local self-government, which has mean that people are involved and feel themselves involved in decisions taken by municipalities and by parliament. We had a poorly designed pension system which short-sightedly was very good for pensioners, but we put the case to the general public that the pension system was not viable in the long term, and people accepted that we introduced a new pension system which in the short run was not as generous as the old system, but had better chances at standing the test of economic strain. This is something that has proved impossible to do in Germany, and in France you now have the strikes of the cheminots when Macron is trying to reform the pension system. In Sweden we did this 20 years ago, and I would say that local self-government is an important explanation because people have been involved in local self-government, and they understand that when the government has an economic problem, they themselves have an economic problem, and they are prepared to accept reforms that are difficult to swallow in the short run, but make sense in a long-term perspective. You have literacy as the next important explanation. And literacy means that we have a fairly high educated population which is prepared to adopt when the labor market changes. And we will see a lot of change in the labor market. So that adaptability is one of our most important assets. And thirdly, we have free trade and competition, because free trade and competition forces your enterprises to be on their toes, because if they're not on their toes, if they don't try to be at the front of modern industrial research, they will not manage. So we have local self-government, literacy, and free trade to thank for the prosperous welfare state That is Sweden of today. Thank you very much for inviting me.